everyone, and welcome. Today, we're diving into something I'm sure you've all felt at some point. Cognitive overload. That feeling of just, too much input.
Yeah, it's like your brain just hits its limit.
Exactly. But the good news is, we can actually design our way out of that feeling, especially online. We'll be looking at a great article by Jon Yablonski. It's called Design Principles for Reducing Cognitive Load.
It's a fantastic resource full of practical tips.
It really is, and we're going to extract those tips so you can use them, whether you're building a website, putting together a presentation.
Even just organizing your own thoughts better.
Right, so think of this as a toolkit for making things easier on the brain.
It's fascinating, how much mental energy we spend just navigating the world, physically and digitally.
It's true, it is like our brains are juggling, and if we add one too many things, boom, everything drops. But before we jump to solutions, what exactly is cognitive load?
You're spot on with that juggling image. Basically, cognitive load is the mental effort it takes to work with new info.
So it's not just the amount of info, but how our brains have to process it.
Exactly. Yablonski actually breaks down the main things that cause this overload. You'd be surprised how common they are.
Okay, let's hear it. What's the first cognitive overload trap to watch out for?
The first one is simply having too many choices. Ever get overwhelmed by a huge restaurant menu?
Ugh, yeah. It's like instead of being excited, you just freeze up.
Exactly. It creates choice paralysis rather than making a good decision.
I end up ordering the same thing every time just to avoid that mental overload. Too many choices can be exhausting. So too many choices. What's the next culprit we need to watch out for?
All right, so the next one is when things require too much thinking, even if they seem simple.
Oh, I know this one. Like those easy assembly instructions that make you feel anything BUT smart.
That's a perfect example.
Yeah.
Let's say you're on a website and the menu is confusing, or trying to put together furniture with bad instructions.
Your brain has to work overtime just to figure it out.
Right, and that leads to frustration and fatigue.
Okay, so we've got too many choices, too much thinking. What's the final villain in this cognitive overload story?
The last one is lack of clarity. Think about searching for info on a website and hitting dead end after dead end.
The worst. It's like being lost in a digital maze. The info might be there, but the design makes it impossible to find.
Exactly. That's a classic example of how a lack of clarity increases cognitive load.
Okay, so we've identified the villains: too many choices, too much thinking, and lack of clarity. But how do we fight back? What are Yablonski's secret weapons for tackling these culprits?
This is where it gets exciting. He offers some really practical design principles, and the first one is what he calls ruthless simplicity.
Ruthless simplicity. I like the sound of that, but doesn't that make things boring?
Not at all. It's not about being bland. It's about cutting the clutter, making bold choices so the important stuff shines through. You see, our brains are constantly trying to make sense of the world, finding patterns and meaning. Too much visual noise makes that harder.
So it's like trying to have a conversation at a rock concert. You can barely hear yourself think over all the noise.
Precisely. Ruthless simplicity is about creating space for the user's brain to breathe and engage with the content in a meaningful way.
It's like clearing out all the mental clutter so you can actually focus on what matters. Yablonski even uses the example of websites with excessive colors or distracting design flourishes that bury the core message.
Right, those elements just add to the cognitive load.
Okay, ruthless simplicity, got it. What's the next tool in our arsenal?
The next one is leveraging what we might call familiar friends, or in design terms, using common design patterns.
Familiar friends, I like that. So we're talking about pre-existing solutions to common problems that people already know how to use.
Exactly. Think about it. You don't have to relearn how a door handle works every time you see a new one.
So it's like muscle memory for our brains. We see a pattern we recognize, and we instantly know what to do.
Yes. And that familiarity reduces cognitive load. Design patterns tap into our existing knowledge, so we don't waste mental energy figuring things out from scratch.
Makes sense. Can you give us an example of a familiar design pattern?
Sure. A great example is the hamburger menu that's so common these days. Those three little lines you see in a lot of apps and websites.
Oh, right. Those three lines. I never thought of it as a design pattern, but it makes total sense.
It leverages our spatial memory. We've learned to associate those three lines with a hidden menu so we know where to look for additional options.
So we're not just presenting information, we're actually designing an experience that takes advantage of how our brains already work.
Exactly. That's the power of using familiar patterns.
That makes a lot of sense. And Yablonski even recommends some resources like design patterns on CodePen and the blueprint archives on CodeDrops for inspiration, right?
Absolutely. Those are fantastic resources for exploring well-established design patterns that you can adapt to your own projects.
Okay, so ruthless simplicity and familiar friends, noted. What else does Yablonski recommend?
All right, this next one is about offloading the mental work for the user. Basically, we as designers can anticipate their needs and streamline the experience.
So instead of just presenting information, we're thinking ahead and making things smoother for the user.
Exactly. We can take on some of that cognitive burden. For example, we can set smart defaults in forms so users don't have to start from scratch.
That's super helpful. I hate filling out forms that make me re-enter the same information over and over again.
Right. Or we can use info they've already given us to save them time. Yablonski gives the example of autofilling forms with previously entered information.
It's those little things that can make a huge difference in how easy something feels to use. It's like the design is working with you, not against you. He even mentions anticipatory design, which sounds pretty futuristic.
It is a fascinating area, but even without getting too fancy, the core idea is simple. Make things easy.
Okay, so we've got ruthless simplicity, familiar friends, and offloading mental work. This is a pretty powerful toolkit already. What else is on Yablonski's list of cognitive load-busting strategies?
Well, remember that first culprit we talked about, choice overload. Yablonski has some great advice for taming that beast, which we'll dive into after a quick break. Welcome back. We're digging deeper into taming that cognitive overload.
I'm already starting to see things differently after learning about these design principles. Like, I've got the secret decoder ring for why some things online feel easy and others, oof,
Yeah,
headache city.
that's exactly it. It's about awareness. And remember, this isn't just tea for digital stuff. Websites, presentations,
Even organizing our own thoughts, it all ties in.
right, because ultimately it's how our brains handle information.
So true. As we keep going through Yablonski's ideas, let's remember that juggling analogy. Each design choice is like adding or taking away a ball.
Perfect way to put it. Now, we were talking about choice overload before the break. This is a big one.
It really is. Those giant online stores, pages and pages of options, it's just exhausting. So how do we, whether we're designing or just presenting info, help people avoid that mental meltdown?
Yablonski's got a really practical tip here. It's about grouping choices logically.
Okay, how so?
Imagine a well-organized grocery store. Everything's categorized. You find what you need quickly.
It's the difference between feeling overwhelmed and feeling in control. I get it.
Exactly. Same for websites, apps, even a presentation. Clear structure lets people scan and find stuff without getting lost.
Instead of just dumping a ton of choices on them, we got to think about how to categorize them.
Right.
Make it easy to navigate.
Exactly. Website navigation, product filters, online menus, it all applies.
Grouping choices logically, check. What's next on Yablonski's list of cognitive load busters?
This one might seem obvious, but it's easy to overlook. Readability.
We talking making sure the text is big enough.
It's more than that. It's making text enjoyable to read. Yablonski says content shouldn't just be legible, it should be a pleasure to engage with.
Like the difference between a dry textbook and a good novel. Words are the same, but the experience is totally different.
Exactly. And that's where typography comes in. Fonts, line spacing, headings, all that affects how easily we read.
So it's not just what we're saying, but how it looks on the page.
Right. Good typography makes a huge difference because it lets the reader focus on the content. No distractions. When it's done well, you barely notice it.
Typography got it. Another tool in our cognitive load-busting belt. Starting to feel like a design superhero here, haha.
That's the spirit. And speaking of tools, Yablonski's got one that might surprise you. He says, use icons with caution.
Wait, really? I thought icons were supposed to be helpful, like little visual shortcuts.
They can be. But he points out they're not always as intuitive as we think. Some are universal, like print, close, play, pause.
Yeah, those are pretty clear.
But a lot of others need prior knowledge. If you don't know what it means, it's just another thing to figure out, actually aiding to cognitive load.
Oh, like trying to understand a word in another language just becomes a confusing symbol.
Exactly. So his solution is simple. Pair icons with text labels. No more guessing games. Everyone gets it, regardless of their experience.
Ah, so two ways to understand visual and text working together.
Precisely. Multiple paths to understanding, accommodating different learners.
Okay, we've covered a lot, T. Simplifying, grouping choices, typography, icons. I'm already feeling more equipped to make things user-friendly.
That's great. And remember, these are just highlights from Yablonski's work. There's more to explore, but this is a solid foundation.
It's amazing how much goes into making things not just look good, but also feel good to use mentally. But before we wrap up, any key takeaways you'd like to emphasize for our listener? Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into cognitive load.
It's been a really interesting journey, hasn't it? I hope everyone listening is feeling a bit more equipped to, actually think about this stuff in their own lives.
Absolutely. Jon Yablonski's article, it's given us a lot to chew on, not just pointing out the problem of cognitive overload, but like actual solutions.
And he's done it so well. It's practical, but it also makes you really think about design differently.
Right. It's not about making things simple for the sake of being simple.
Mhm.
There's an understanding of how our brains actually work.
Exactly. It's about empathy, isn't it? Meeting the user where they're at.
Yeah. Finding that sweet spot where there's enough information, but not so much that it overwhelms,
Mm.
and making it engaging too.
That's key. All those principles we've talked about, the simplicity, the patterns, typography, it all builds towards a better experience.
It really does feel like conducting an orchestra. All these different instruments, but they have to work together.
Great analogy. Just like a conductor, we as designers, we're guiding the user's journey, making it smooth, enjoyable.
You know what's striking me is how this goes beyond just websites or apps. I'm
Uh,
noticing it everywhere now, the way a store's laid out, a well-written sign.
Once you start seeing it, it's hard to stop.
Yeah.
It really highlights how these principles, they apply to so much of life.
It's like we've got this superpower now to make things better, not just for ourselves, but everyone around us.
Exactly. And that brings us back to your question, that one big takeaway from Yablonski.
Hmm.
He talks about how the less someone has to think about how W to do something, the more likely they are to do it successfully.
That's powerful. So everyone listening, think about a time you were frustrated online, a confusing website, a bad form. Ask yourself, how could the design have been better?
Because in a way, we're all designers shaping experiences for each other.
It's true. And by thinking about cognitive load, we can make those experiences so much more enjoyable,
Yeah.
productive, even meaningful.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned something new and feel inspired to create more user-friendly experiences in everything you do.
Keep exploring, keep learning. There's always more to discover.